The CIA initially got a hold of a directory with home phone numbers of some of these Stasi foreign intelligence people, and they started cold calling them like salesmen.
What happened to the world of espionage after the fall of the Berlin Wall? Dan Fesperman is here to talk about his latest thriller, Winter Work.
You see my life on paper, you think, oh, somebody that's growing up in a soup kitchen and in an unhoused shelter, those must have been the tough years. But those were actually the best years of my life.
Isaac Fitzgerald discusses his new memoir, Dirtbag, Massachusetts. Plus, Liz Harris has news from the publishing world, and Dwight Garner and Molly Young will talk about books they've recently reviewed. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's July 29th. I'm John Williams. Dan Fesperman is the author of many acclaimed thrillers set all around the world. His latest, his 13th, is Winter Work, and he's here to talk about it. Dan, nice to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So this is a thriller, and so we will not dampen any of the thrills by giving away too much, but let's talk about the basic setup of the story. Where do we start the book?
We began just a few months after the Berlin Wall has come down. It's early 1990. Everything in the former East Germany is in chaos, and we're zeroing in on Emil Grimm, who was high up in the Stasi's Foreign Intelligence Service, and he's already been locked out of his office. He's about to get his last paycheck. He has a wife who's disabled, and he's fled to a dacha up in the woods of a small village just north of Berlin to kind of collect himself and wonder what he does next, because he might even be facing prosecution from the West German government.
And so in the first scene, he's strolling in a forest near this dacha, this small home that he lives in. And what happens in that scene?
He comes across the body of a colleague who also has a dacha and has moved up to the woods, and a colleague from Foreign Intelligence, someone who he's had a close working relationship with anyway, maybe a little distant personally at times. But to his dismay, it is already marked off as a murder scene, and instead of finding the police there, he finds other members of the Stasi from a special branch that deal with politically sensitive crimes, even though they should be just as out of business as he is. So he's upset, he's puzzled by what's going on, and he's trying to figure out what this means for his own future.
Is it particularly tricky or time-consuming to decide how to open novels like the ones you write? I assume that there's some pressure to really grab people and to give them a sense of the things that are at stake in the kind of world we're inhabiting.
Yeah, there really is, because you feel more and more of that pressure to kind of open, not literally with a bang, but with something that will grab people's attention, because you feel like attention spans are a little shorter than they used to be. I think my training as a foreign correspondent and a journalist, when you were always taught that the lead was all important, and I think that does help, and also the nut graph and things like that. You find yourself applying some of those principles, but in a much broader way, and I hope in a much more leisurely and enticing way.
Do you find yourself experimenting in your head, not necessarily writing a bunch of different scenes, but do you find yourself thinking about different ways you could open and it takes you a bit to land on the right one, or does it tend to come to you fairly quickly?
It's different with every one, but with all of them, there tends to be this epiphany or this moment where a certain, not so much a scenario occurs to you, but a sentence, a phrase, a description. And it can happen while you're eating lunch. It can happen at 2 a.m. when you wake up and you have to scramble in the dark for a notebook and write it down. And then in the morning, you might love it. In the morning, you might say, what was I thinking? But it usually revolves around, for me at least, one phrase that kind of opens up the possibilities for me.
Oh, interesting. Rather than a scene or a visual, it's a phrase. So the Stasi, the very large and brutal security service in East Germany, is obviously thrown into a pretty tumultuous moment when the wall comes down. This wasn't something that was, a planned deacceleration or anything. So what happens to the Stasi in the immediate aftermath of the Berlin Wall coming down? What's the state of it?
The first thing they do is they start shredding documents as fast as they can, destroying other documents in other ways, shipping off copies of some sensitive material that they think that their sort of brother agency and the KGB might want a copy of. And then their second reflex becomes more personalized, depending on who did what. They start thinking, all right, what am I going to do to save my own skin here?
And Grimm is thinking about that himself. Paint a little bit of a portrait of him in terms of his, is he a very loyal person? Does he feel disillusioned by the Stasi? Is he sort of ready to tell his secrets because he's putting himself first?
He began as a very loyal employee, but became disillusioned over the years for a reason that a fair number of them, including his old boss, Marcus Wolf, he's become disillusioned with what he has seen as the failure to deliver on all of the promises of the regime, the emptiness of the slogans of the regime, and frankly, the degree to which the Stasi on its domestic side was interfering and snooping into everyone's lives. In this population of 17 million people, you maybe had about, at the top, maybe 1 million people informing on fellow citizens. And he tries to hold himself above that as a foreign intelligence operative, but he realizes he's a part of it as well. And a certain sense of shame has developed over the years as well.
So from about 30,000 feet, what are the mechanics of the plot as the book moves forward? He comes into contact with Americans at some point. What is that relationship like, and what's the drama at the center of the book?
The drama at the center of the book is Emil trying to survive, but also this American who comes into the scene most closely to him, Claire Saylor, who has been called in by the CIA, because the CIA at this time, there was a moment in the White House where the president at the time, George H.W. Bush, who was a former CIA director, was watching protesters in East Germany throw documents out the window of a Stasi office and kind of said in an offhand way, I hope we're getting some of that. And there's no such thing really as an offhand remark by a president who used to run the CIA. So the CIA scrambled. They sent a top official over to Berlin to say, basically, what are we doing about this? Are we getting their secrets before they disappear or before their shelf life is over? And so Claire is part of that mission to try to win this Cold War endgame of getting these secrets and finding out where all of East Germany's foreign agents were and who they were and what they were up to. And Emil has connections with, including with his recently killed colleague, Lothar Fischer, who he has access to possibly some of these deeper secrets. And so it becomes this cat and mouse between Claire Saylor and Emil to try to negotiate some sort of deal. But in the meantime, there are other competitors, including some KGB people who also have access to some of those same secrets. And that's where it gets sticky and even dangerous for Emil in trying to negotiate his way forward.
So was that comment by the first President Bush the spark that set you on this book, or was there a larger fact or true story that you learned about to tell the story?
I read about the CIA's pursuit of these files in some news coverage years later. They even gave it a name for their operation. I'd never heard of it, and I still haven't heard much about it. And I started poking around and looking for more information about this operation that occurred after the fall of the wall. And the bad thing was that there really isn't much information that's public. But that was also the good thing, because as any historic novelist or novelist who looks into these things can tell you, you like to find these empty spaces because you can fill them in with your imagination. So I was quite happy to see that it wasn't particularly well documented, because that left the door wide open for me.
So there was plenty of room for you to run around in. Now, yeah, I heard in another interview you said something along the lines of that some of the most ludicrous things in the book are things that really happen. Do you ever feel like you have to almost make reality more convincing for people as a fiction writer?
I feel like when I'm writing some of these scenes that some of the most unbelievable moments in the book actually happen. And I urge anyone who reads this book to read the acknowledgments at the end, because it talks about the points where the book intersects with actual events and actual characters. And so, yeah, it's pretty funny when you're writing the scene that you feel like is the least plausible, and that's the one that actually happened.
Was there something in particular that you remember from this book or even a previous one where you tripped upon something and you thought, my God, and you knew you were going to put it in the book, but you almost thought, how am I going to make people believe this really happened?
Yeah, in this book, the CIA initially had people calling ex-Stasi agents. They got a hold of a directory with home phone numbers of some of these Stasi foreign intelligence people, and they started cold calling them. And, like salesmen, like these irritating calls we get at home, except for the Stasi, it was the CIA calling. Hey, would you like to share your secrets with us? We can pay you. They were getting mostly hang-ups, a lot of angry lectures. And when that quickly didn't work out, they then began visiting them door to door, like door-to-door salesmen, which didn't work a whole lot better either.
But I guess that's one of those things where if 1 in 1,000 works, you might get some good stuff.
Yeah. And obviously they had gotten this directory, which allowed them to contact, but they were getting a lot of walk-ins too. And walk-ins are helpful, but they're also often unreliable, because these are people who are already have it in mind that I'm going to sell this stuff to the highest bidder. They might not be all that reliable. They might be still trying to protect themselves more than their agency. So
you mentioned Claire Saylor, the CIA agent in the book. She had a supporting role in your novel Safe Houses, and then she was the lead character in your most recent novel before this one, The Cover Wife. So she's back. Did this character have to be her, if that makes sense, or did it just seem fun to bring her back and make it her?
It didn't have to be her, but I had so much fun with her as sort of the sidekick character in Safe Houses that I decided, as you said, to use her again in The Cover Wife. And so when this book came along, it was in her era. And I already had a good feel for her. And so I enjoyed using her in this book as well. If you think of this as a series of 3 books, it wasn't well planned out by me, because Safe Houses would have been parts 1 and 4 of her saga, and The Cover Wife would have been part 3, and this would be part 2. So it's not like I've made this great linear plan.
We should emphasize that these are very much standalone novels, but it might be considered a loose Claire Saylor trilogy in your bibliography.
Yes, exactly.
You said that you knew her and it was easy to get back into her perspective and put her on the page. You've made a point that before these last few books, you really weren't interested in having, your books don't have one agent who sort of is a through line for all of them. Did writing Claire in this book make you think, oh, maybe I should be doing that more because there's this kind of shorthand and it maybe gives me a little bit of a shortcut to getting into certain parts of the book?
I don't think so, because I think if I did that as a habit, I think it would start to get stale. Half the fun of it for me is coming up with an entirely new cast of characters, often a new setting and a new era even. So I probably won't do that.
I know that you were an international reporter at the Baltimore Sun for many years and that your stations abroad did a lot to inspire the stories of your books. What I don't know is, I believe your first novel was published in 1999, whether there was an immediate cleaving between your journalist career and your novelist career, or whether you maintained the newspaper job for a bit while you wrote a couple of books.
I remained a reporter for about 6 years after my first book came out in 99, and I'd written it. I wrote my first 3 books while I was still a reporter. It was a bit of a schizoid existence there for a while, and physically it was very demanding. We had 2 young children at the time, and my wife would, also a full-time reporter, would get them off to school while I got up at 6 and I wrote for about 3 hours. Then I'd run off to my news job, and it was my job to get home and get dinner on the table and pick them up from anything they might have after school. So in sharing those responsibilities, I would find that by the time I'd get to Friday, I was just exhausted. But I finally did quit the day job in about 2005 after my 3rd novel.
You did spend, as part of your time as a foreign correspondent, a few years in Germany in the mid-1990s. What role did that play in your picture of Berlin in this book? How much of it was recalling your own experiences there?
Yeah, I was there from 93 to 96. So I was there about 3 years after this novel is set. But still, even though Berlin and East Germany were changing so rapidly at the time, in the place where I first had my office and in a lot of neighborhoods of East Berlin, they still looked exactly as they had during the Cold War. There were fair amounts of the wall that were still standing. The former death zone had been cleared, but it still wasn't built on yet. That was just about to start up. So there was this interesting sense of newness and of rapid change still going on. So it was invaluable in shaping all of this, and it made me much more comfortable with the material than I think I would have been.
Did you meet any former Stasi officials?
I talked to a couple in the early days. I also did an interview with a fellow who was brought in, a clergyman named Joachim Gauck, who he was in charge of opening up all the records of domestic surveillance, so you could go in and see your Stasi file and find out who'd been informing on you. And I talked to quite a few people who were victims of that. So I brushed up against that culture in a lot of different ways at the time.
In addition to your own experience, so much experience around the world, what kind of research do you do for a book like this? Do you read about the Stasi in a very targeted way, or do you read more broadly? And I guess the question is, do you research for what you know you need, or do you sort of let the research lead you to things that you weren't expecting to include?
I start with that broad reading. I read as much as I could, general histories. I wanted to read about how Stasi officers, especially on the foreign intelligence side, were recruited, what kind of backgrounds they had, what they thought about the other side on the domestic side. So it's very broad. And what I'm looking for are little things that catch my interest, and then I'll go off on little tangents in my research for a while. But my most valuable research was going back over to Berlin to visit some of these sites that are up here in the book.
You've been with the publishing house Knopf for a while now, and you also worked for a while with Sonny Mehta, the legendary editor who died at the end of 2019. I'm curious what it was like to work with him, and also more generally what it's like to work with editors as a writer of spy thrillers. How much of, obviously, they'll suggest tightening a line here or there, but are there any larger conversations about consistency or plot points, or do you pretty much have that down at this point?
The editing is always a great help to me. And with Sonny, it was this wonderful old school type of situation where he would read the manuscript and I'd go up there and we would have this long, leisurely lunch, usually followed by a conversation in his office where we would discuss the book. I would take notes. He was a very big picture editor. And we would talk about maybe 3 or 4 things that the book needed more of, or a better focus. We would talk about maybe 3 or 4 things that it needed less of. We would talk about the characters, which ones were strong, which ones needed some help. And then I would take my notes, I would go back and I would work on revisions. Fortunately, as Sonny's duties piled higher and higher as he became publisher, not just of Knopf, but of Knopf Doubleday, and everything grew and he had more and more to do. More of the editing started to shift to Edward Kastenmeier, who became my full-time editor after Sonny passed away. And I feel privileged to have worked with Sonny. Just a wonderful man to be around. He always had some great book recommendations, as you would expect, and his taste was impeccable. And Edward is the same way. Edward's always had great recommendations for me as well on what to read. So we're talking to each other as readers as much as writer and editor in both cases, and that's been a real pleasure.
You are a prolific writer. You started publishing novels, like I said, at basically the turn of the millennium, and this is your 13th. Do you have a sense of where in the world your next one will be? I won't push you for too many specifics.
Yeah, I'm going to try something a little different in that I'm going to set it in a fictional Eastern European country that looks a little bit or feels a little bit like Hungary, with its current leader, Viktor Orban. But I didn't want to use Orban as the prototype, but it's going to be set in a country like that. And I'm finding that it's interesting and kind of fun to set up my own little world, which will seem familiar to anyone who's either been to Budapest or Prague or Krakow or cities like that maintain sort of this old world charm, but usually at a cost of having accommodated one occupier or another over the years.
So that's the 14th to look forward to. For now, the 13th, just out, is Winter Work. Dan Fesperman, it was great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Isaac Fitzgerald is here. He is the author of not one, but 2 books about tattoos, Pen and Ink, and Knives and Ink, a book for young readers called How to Be a Pirate. He is generally also a literary man about town in too many ways to describe. He is now the author of a memoir called Dirtbag, Massachusetts. Our reviewer, Michael Ian Black, says that Fitzgerald nestles comfortably on a bar stool beside writers like Kerouac, Bukowski, Richard Price, and Pete Hamill. Isaac, thanks for being here to talk about it.
John, thank you so much for having me on.
So you say in the book that your family was really into stories and that you've learned the power of a good opening line. And the first line of your book is, "My parents were married when they had me, just to different people." So tell me how easy it was to choose that as your first line, and also how old your parents were when this happened, and more of the story behind how they had you.
So almost for as long as I can remember, I knew that was a good opening line. And I used it a lot throughout my life. As you get to know a friend and you get to know each other better, you ask about your history, your life story in a way. And I knew that I had a good opening line with that. It piques interest, but it also in a way can be a little bit funny, and it allowed me to maybe deflect before ever going into some like the truly harder things in my life. The line I usually would follow it up with was like, basically, what a joy to have life because 2 people couldn't help themselves. But so they were in their 30s. They were both obviously in marriages themselves, but I think they were very curious people. And I think they didn't have a lot of money, but books and education was very important to them. So my mother was actually married to a minister, and so had decided to go to divinity school in a way to almost help out. And I think my father was maybe a little bit more adrift in the world, looking for meaning. And when I say that, what I mean is this is a man who loved the writings of Thomas Merton, was getting really involved with his faith, not in kind of an institutional sense, but in more of a thoughtful sense. And so they met, and apparently sparks flew. But for a very long time, I think they wanted to not blow up their lives. And that is exactly, of course, when my mom became pregnant with me.
Well, they were in their 30s, and you say in the book that they were married to their high school sweethearts. So at this point, they're people who, even if they are curious or questing, have built lives that look pretty conventional. And how much do you think were they broiling sort of underneath for those years through their teenage years and their 20s to get to this point?
I think they were both looking for more out of life. And I do really think that was part of it. So what happens is when my mother becomes pregnant with me, there's of course a lot of confusion and a lot of thought that goes into that moment. But what ends up happening is eventually my mother makes the decision to have me. And they end up, of course, both separate from their partners because their partners kick them out of their house. So then they find themselves unhoused for a short time, living with a professor that was helping them, who then introduced them to the Catholic Worker, which is an incredible socialist Catholic organization started by Dorothy Day. And through there, they got involved with that community, both as people who lived at the shelter and then eventually making their way to a place called John Larry House, which was like a halfway home. And they become people that are both benefiting from the Catholic Worker and also volunteering at the Catholic Worker, which is exactly what that organization is all about.
Massachusetts is in the title. Where in Massachusetts are we when all of this is happening?
We're in the south end of Boston. The joke is if only we had the money to buy a little property, because it's a lot different now than it was in the 80s. But we're in the south end of Boston. Dartmouth Street was where the Haley House Soup Kitchen, I believe, used to be. I think I heard that it's changed location since. And then John Larry House was right there on Mass Ave.
You write in the book that you think of your life as divided into two parts, before and after you were 8 years old. What happened when you were that age?
So at the age of 8, after a few violent incidents that happened in the neighborhood, after maybe them coming to the realization that the ways that they just exploded their lives really didn't fix everything. And in fact, the striving might be within them. I don't want to speak for my parents' inner thoughts, but around the age of 8 is when my mother decides to move out to north central Massachusetts, where her parents are from. And they have this kind of farm, and there was this dilapidated house on that land. And she decided that she could move in there with me. My father, the story that I was told at the time, and that's a very big part of this book, is what stories are told to us and how those stories shape us. But I was told at the time that my father couldn't find work out there, and that's why he stayed in the city. It's pretty clear that they were separating and at least experimenting with that. And so my father stayed in the city, and my mother and I moved out to this drafty farmhouse in north central Massachusetts. And that is when things became complicated. When you see my life on paper, you think, oh, somebody that's growing up in a soup kitchen and in an unhoused shelter, those must have been the tough years. But those were actually the best years of my life. That community was so wonderful. And I was surrounded by so many different characters. And it was such a great place to be a child and have just all these brilliant things to capture your imagination. Out at the farmhouse, it was lonely. It was desolate. It was really just me and my mother. And I think she was going through some true mental health issues. And at that point, she had nobody else around her to lean on. So in a way, I changed from being her son to becoming her confidant, to becoming a crutch that she was leaning on.
You were also, I believe, with your grandmother in that situation. What was her role in this?
I was able to give my parents a little more grace in this book. And part of that was recognizing that my story didn't start with my birth. My story starts with the things that happened to them. And nobody loomed larger, especially over my mother's life, than my grandmother. And to be honest, I want to give my grandmother even understanding and grace, but she grew up in a very hard time. She was a very flinty woman, but I think that the life she had led and the poverty that she had experienced made her that way. Because in many different ways, she could be very caring. She was incredible with crafts. She was incredible with the animals. But I think she had a true sense of life could be hard. And I think she really disapproved of my mother's decision, not just to blow up her marriage, but in a way to have me. And so all of a sudden I was living next to this couple, my grandparents, who had this very complicated feelings, not just towards my mother, but towards myself. And I watched as my mother grappled with basically the criticism and the harshness that they held over their decisions. For her to be moving back to her hometown, I think really felt like my grandparents, her parents saying, "We told you so."
Mm. Were they emotionally abusive to both your mother and you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to be clear. At sometimes they were also like my grandmother also makes an incredible apple pie. Sometimes they were wonderful, but the memory that I have is instinctually as a child, very quickly, I started avoiding them, avoiding their house, avoiding that. I really would go off into the woods by myself. I realized that something didn't feel right. My mother, I would remember, would go over there once a week. And on more than one occasion, I went over, peeked over a windowsill basically and watched, and she's just sobbing. And they are just sitting there, not yelling, kind of this cool, icy anger that I would actually later see reflected in my father as well, but just sitting there and just telling her all the things that she had done wrong. Almost no acceptance, no grace, no forgiveness.
There are a lot of ways that different kids and their temperaments might react to both the desolation of the place, the sort of remoteness of it, the loneliness of it, and some of the abuse you're witnessing. You became pretty quickly a pretty tough kid and guy. I mean, if I'm reading the book correctly, you're smoking cigarettes at 8 or 9. Is that right? Smuggling them in the forest walks.
Very quickly, it became apparent to me that I could steal cigarettes at the country store, and that led to me smoking at a very young age. And then by 12, I am drinking, and I've realized that I can trade those cigarettes for different things. And eventually, I'm doing mushrooms, smoking weed. There's not a lot of kids out there, so there's a regional school that 4 towns pour into, and it's literally middle graders all through seniors. So very quickly, once I was in that situation, I was befriending 18-year-olds because I knew I wanted to get away from my house. They would usually have trucks. So that led to me growing up very quickly.
And you're breaking into houses and you're stealing from stores, you're drinking, you and your friends start a fight club at one point, so you're getting knocked around. What are your teenage years like into sort of the late teens, early 20s? What does your young adulthood start to look like?
That is another pivotal moment for me, almost in the same way that 8 was a pivotal moment and that move was a pivotal moment. Because I want to be clear, eventually my father does make his way out of the city. We do come back together as a family. I think my mother and I's relationship, although incredibly difficult, also brought us almost incredibly close. And slowly but surely, I mean, after some very difficult moments, her attempting suicide multiple times, violence in the home, they do start to get better. I think they start to realize that they can figure out a way to lead their life. But around that time is around the time that I'm 12. And that's when I start to get worse. It's this realization that I had. I slowly understood that the childhood I had just had was not a normal one, and not in the way that was fun like it was in Boston, but truly in a way that I realized I was very angry about. So I immediately started acting out. But I also, again, I always knew, and my parents had instilled in me this love of writing, this love of books, this love of education from a very early age. Anytime we moved, none of the furniture came, but their milk crates and milk crates and milk crates of books came. And I want to give them credit for that, because the other thing I knew was that if I got good grades in school, I was less likely to get in trouble. But again, with the ways that I was acting out, eventually that did protect me. I got into a fight right there in the middle of a hallway, and I get an in-school suspension because they knew at that point, other adults in my life were starting to figure out that maybe things weren't so hot at home. So they knew they didn't want to send me home for that week. So they gave me an in-school suspension. And it was during that time period that I actually befriended secretaries at the school, librarians, and those women came together in such a meaningful way and understood that I could maybe potentially go to college. Would be a great example. I wasn't planning on going to college, but maybe there was a world in which in a better system, I would be flourishing and not floundering. And so there was a local boarding school. It offered scholarships, full scholarships to local kids that showed potential, especially even local kids who showed potential, but maybe were a little rough around the edges. They helped me apply for it. And that's that pivotal moment. All of a sudden, I go from this very desolate situation to the privilege of a New England boarding school.
But as you get older, you work at a bar, you befriend other tough customers. It's funny to me because as someone who knows you, we haven't met before this moment, but I've watched your career and I know you as part of the literary community, and you radiate a positive energy, let's put it that way. And you frequently talk about the importance of community and the bonds between people and how important that is. I'm wondering what that balance was like between, you almost seem like someone who would be in a fight club, but kind of smiling through it. Did you always have an effervescence beneath or coexisting with the anger? Or did you go through a phase where you were just completely bitter and angry and you kind of came out of it and your personality changed?
I think I learned at a very young age to stay in touch with what, quote unquote, and this is my therapist, which I started therapy 3 years ago, and that's really in this book and really helped me with so much of this. But I can almost see her nodding her head no, because there's no such thing as positive and negative emotions. But at the time, I really thought there was. So I was really tuned in to what I would consider positive emotions, because in a way, I knew that was a way, again, to keep me out of trouble. I knew that if I was walking around just like incredibly upset all the time, people would immediately know that there was something wrong at home. And that's something I felt shame about. I wanted to hide that. And then especially going into a boarding school setting, I learned how to act a certain way. And I would start acting that way at boarding school because there were all these opportunities for me. I'd barely been out of the state. I had never been on a plane. And all of a sudden, kids who liked me would take me on trips with them. Like I was going to all these incredible places. And I knew that if I acted a certain way, again, not overly thankful, but definitely not ungrateful, that could get me further in life. And so I did have general positivity. And I want to be clear that positivity is real. But what I didn't have was any connection to these other real emotions, which as an adult, I'm realizing are just as important. I would lock my anger away, and then it would come out in very weird ways. I would lock my sadness away, and then it would come out in all these different weird ways. And to get to what you're saying about the bar, it was my therapist who first really pointed it out to me, that basically the Catholic Church, my home, were places people would usually think of as safe, were not. But I did then find safety and community in this biker bar, the Armory SA, which is a place that maybe people wouldn't assume someone so young would feel safe. But that became such a clear thing for me. Like, was I effervescent and smiling? Yes. I'll tell you right now, at Zeitgeist, the bar, there's a guy, Todd, who said, "Stop smiling so much. You're messing with our tips." Don't get me wrong. I was always that. I wish I could paint some picture of me dark and brooding, but no, I was smiling. But what it really was me trying to hide so much of what had happened.
My last question is about the title, because the word dirtbag, when I was a kid on Long Island, that word got tossed around a lot. It is not the most, there are worse, but it's not the most PC word. And so there's something to me that feels like you're reclaiming it in a way in the title. What does that word mean to you? And also, what does this book, maybe on the most general, broad levels, have to say about people who might be called that, or macho men, or men in America in general?
It is absolutely that, a reclaiming. But I want to give a quick shout out to Jason Diamond, who's a wonderful writer and author, because he's the one that came up with this title, which is a fantastic title. I was joking. I lived in a town called Athol, Massachusetts, which everyone called Rat Hole, Massachusetts, and apologies if this is not appropriate for the podcast, but Hole, Massachusetts. I was saying, well, you can't call a book Hole, Massachusetts. And Jason just didn't blink. He said, "Why not Dirtbag, Massachusetts?" And that really clicked into place. Like, that was in place maybe before I even realized what these essays were actually going to contain. So for me, I wear it as a badge of honor because I remember the pride that so many of my friends had growing up. We were very poor kids in what is a very rich state, especially in Massachusetts. You really bump up against more privileged people all the time. And with my experience at boarding school, it was even more that. And so I was grappling with class. We all were, from a very young age. And so we took on this kind of blue collar working class pride that I've really held on to my whole life. And the older I get, the more appreciative I get to it. So I wanted to write something that 14-year-old me might have stuffed in their back pocket as a paperback that they maybe stole from the library. I wanted a book that would be passed around because I was 23 when I first even began to think that maybe I could do something like this. And so I want to give somebody an opportunity to live their life a little more intentionally from a younger age. And so that's what I hope this book does. The other thing I do want it to do in terms of men in America, I think there's so much that we're coming to terms with now, but for so long, there has been a lack of introspection. And I say this as somebody, and I've never said this, but I'll say this on a podcast. I read a lot, but there was times in my younger years where I wouldn't read stories that didn't have anything for me. I didn't have an inquisitive reading palette. I wasn't maybe interested in stories unless they like had, it's got to be tough. It's got to be this, which is why that Michael Ian Black line that you opened with meant so much to me. I will say it. Those were the writers I grew up reading and I loved them so much. But for me in this book, I realized that I started then going on similar types of adventures and trying to live similar types of lives. And it wasn't serving me. So I wanted to, don't get me wrong, it's still fun to do so much of that stuff. So I wanted to keep that joy and kind of lust for life, while also examining the fact that it might be caused by pain, this want to go out and adventure, and it might be causing other people pain too. And so that's what I was really grappling with and hoping to tackle in this book, which is the sooner you start working on your own issues and stop trying to ignore them, the better off you're going to be.
Well, this is not just a book for dirtbags.
Thank you for saying that, John.
We'll end by emphasizing that the book, again, is a memoir called Dirtbag Massachusetts by Isaac Fitzgerald. Isaac, it was great to have you here. Thanks for making the time.
John, I so appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you so much.
My colleague Liz Harris is here now with news from the publishing world. Hi, Liz.
Hi, John.
This is news from the publishing / business / legal world.
/ government world. True.
What's going on?
So a really major trial in the publishing world will get underway starting on Monday. The government is suing Penguin Random House to stop it from acquiring Simon & Schuster on antitrust grounds. So the government's basic argument is if the deal goes through, Penguin Random House would have too much power over certain authors. Right now, there are 5 really big publishers in the country. PRH is by far the largest, and Simon & Schuster is another one of the major players. And the government's argument is that the biggest companies are the ones that most frequently buy the biggest books, like books that it defines as anticipated top sellers, which publishers buy for more than $250,000. And the Department of Justice says that if the number of those big publishers goes from 5, where it currently is, down to 4, it will reduce the competition for those top-selling books and drive down their prices, lessening the amounts that authors make. And Penguin Random House says the acquisition would actually be good for competition. They say efficiencies created by combining the two companies will allow them to pay more for manuscripts than the two companies do now, which will then force other major players to increase their bids to compete. They also say that the publishing industry is much larger than just these 5 big players. Companies like Disney and Amazon also publish books, and there are countless smaller and mid-sized players.
And obviously, when Simon & Schuster offered itself up for sale, it wasn't shocking that a place like Penguin Random House would make the offer. But if the court says that this is a no-go, what happens to Simon & Schuster then?
They're going to be sold regardless. They're owned by Paramount Global, which used to be called Viacom CBS. They don't want the publisher anymore. They're going to focus on other parts of their business. And Penguin Random House offered to buy it for $2 billion, more than $2 billion. This is a big deal. And if it doesn't go through, a number of things might happen. I mean, Simon & Schuster will definitely get sold, but there's also a kill fee involved with this deal, which is that if it doesn't go through, Penguin Random House has to pay the Simon & Schuster parent company $200 million. But they're going to be sold anyway. So given the scrutiny that this deal has been under and the way the government has approached it, is a company like HarperCollins or Hachette, which are some of the other big players who might be interested in acquiring Simon & Schuster, are they going to think it's worth it to go down this road and maybe have to defend the lawsuit? And maybe this might make them less likely to go after it. It might indicate that the government would be less likely to approve it. So then maybe Simon & Schuster gets bought by private equity, which makes a lot of people in the industry very nervous because, it could lead to layoffs. Private equity is not in the business of publishing books, which Penguin Random House is.
The trial starts on Monday, and it's scheduled to last 3 weeks. There are some big names who are going to be called to testify, including Marcus Dole, the CEO of Penguin Random House, and Jonathan Karp, the CEO of Simon & Schuster, who has been a big name in publishing for many years. Authors, too. Is Stephen King going to be there?
Stephen King is going to be there. I mean, it doesn't get much bigger than Stephen King. But yeah, no, they have some interesting witnesses coming.
King is interesting because he's making an argument against consolidation, and yet he's a Simon & Schuster author. They're at cross purposes a little bit.
There's a lot of mixed feelings in the industry about this. A lot of people who work at Simon & Schuster are very nervous about what happens if this deal doesn't go through because they're concerned about being sold to private equity, for example. But even some people who work at Simon Schuster or who write for Simon & Schuster are uncomfortable with the idea of less competition. Like, as you said, there's been so much consolidation in the industry, and this is another step in that direction. That makes people nervous. It can be hard to move around, move up within these companies. And so this also can make it harder to jump from one big company to another if there's one less big company. So not all the editors, even who work at these places, are thrilled about it. So it's really complicated.
I know that you are not a gambling reporter, nor do you have any particular knowledge about how this is going to turn out. But is there a sense in the people you talk to when you're reporting the story? Do people feel like it's leaning one way, like they'd be surprised if it goes one way or another?
I feel like no one really knows. A lot of people were surprised that the Department of Justice decided to intervene in this way. I think most people expected it to go through, maybe with some conditions that Penguin Random House maybe spin off some part of the business, sell something here, sell something there. But most people weren't expecting this. In terms of the trial, it's hard to say. I think the Biden administration is being more aggressive about antitrust concerns than past administrations had. And so this is one of the test cases to see how courts respond.
Yeah, that's been my sense. I've been reading about it, obviously, at a greater distance than you're reporting, but it does feel like part of the drama here is that it genuinely feels like something where we're waiting to find out what's going to happen. It doesn't seem like a fait accompli. So it's a 3-week trial. At the end of the 3 weeks, does the judge raise his gavel and we find out what happens here?
We probably won't find out for a few more months. This is a trial where then after the trial itself is completed, both sides are going to submit more briefs, more court documents saying this is what we think we proved. And then the judge will come back with a written decision sometime after that. So we're probably looking at the fall before we know.
Okay, so we need to be patient, but we'll certainly have you back when the decision is handed down to talk about the impact of this, because it's a huge decision that will have, however it's decided, very, very big impacts on the industry that we cover. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Two of the Times' staff book critics, Dwight Garner and Molly Young, join me now to talk about books they've recently reviewed. Hello, you two.
Hey, John.
Hi, John.
Dwight, you were telling me off air that you've been up since 4 a.m. preparing for this, and that's probably a joke, but I'm going to make you live up to that amount of preparation. What did you review recently?
You got to be prepared for these things, John. The poet Robert Lowell, he's been dead since 1977. He has a new book out called Memoirs, and it's new in the sense that I describe it in my review as a sort of finding an undeveloped roll of film from 1954. In the mid-50s, when he was in his 30s, he was committed to a psychiatric clinic after a manic episode. And as part of his therapy, he started to write personal prose about his family and his childhood. And this personal writing, he never published except for a small amount of it, but it led to the autobiographical poems in his breakthrough book, Life Studies, which came out in 1959. And now this material has resurfaced and it's been published. It's pretty good. I was skeptical. As I write in my review, the world doesn't really need another book by or about Robert Lowell. There have been so many books of his, so many collected poems and selected poems in his notebooks and his letters and his collected prose and his translations. There have been a lot of biographies. There have been a lot of meta-analyses of him. We don't really need more information about Robert Lowell. And yet, his writing is good. I picked this up and I fell right into it. And as many listeners will know, he grew up in this Boston Brahmin family with illustrious ancestors on both sides of the family, some of them on the Mayflower. And he describes the Dresden china chandeliers and the suits of armor in the corners and the Harvard-Yale football games and Sunday roasts and all of that kind of stuff. But he also is sort of a cynic and a class spy, and he really hated his father. And I write in my review, this is one of the most systematic takedowns in American literature of a father.
That's really saying something. I feel like there are a lot of good takedowns. So I'm eager to see all these. The writings about his family that he did in the hospital are a part of this. And then there are memories of writers he knew and things like that, or those things he wrote at other times. We might not know, I guess, when they were written, but there's a lot of odds and ends in this book along with the central family stuff.
What Lowell would do is often when a friend or a peer would die, he would write a remembrance. He called these undertaker's notes or some phrase like that. I probably have it slightly wrong, but they often appeared in the New York Review of Books, which frankly published almost everything Lowell ever wrote. And some of them are pretty good. Some of them are speechy. I think some of them originated as speeches, just stuff about Sylvia Plath and Randall Jarrell and John Crow Ransom and a lot of other poets. And I found them charming. There's some sort of interesting gossip in there and that kind of stuff. There's also some sort of stray little bits of essays, unfinished things, twigs and seeds and nuts that are thrown into this book that aren't so great. One funny thing about this book is that the two editors are terrific. They find that he invented characters in his memoir, and he didn't really intend for it to be published. You can't really blame him. Who knew what he was doing with them? But sometimes he would take a few people and condense them into one. And he always got his facts wrong. And every time he ever quoted another poet, he quoted by memory and never got it right. And it's just hilarious to watch them fix all of his errors in the footnotes. And I had a good time reading the crazy footnotes.
You had a great line in the review that said something like, there's a whole other book going on down there in the footnotes, which I loved as a as a way of thinking of it. It's almost like a dual reading experience, switching back and forth between the two.
Yeah, I do love a good footnote. My favorite footnote of all time is the footnote in one of Nicholson Baker's novels, I think The Mezzanine, which is a footnote about footnotes in general, which is great, which is the ultimate meta footnote.
I feel like Baker doesn't get as much credit as he should because David Foster Wallace sort of outshone him in the footnote mania, but he's a progenitor there. I'm not as familiar with, any prose that Lowell might have written as much as his poetry. So is this prose, does it have a kind of characteristic style, or is it a little bit all over the map?
It's sort of all over the map. A lot of the stuff is memories of other poets and memories of other sort of periods in his life. Like I said, in his breakthrough book, Life Studies, he includes a small part of this memoir, a famous piece called, I believe it's called 91 Revere Street. I'm sure that's right, actually. And that's here too. And so, yeah, his nonfiction is sort of a hodgepodge, but a good hodgepodge.
Sounds like Robert Lowell trail mix. And your review of it definitely made it sound like a book worth perusing, picking out the choicest seeds and nuts in there.
Yeah, definitely.
Molly, the book you reviewed just recently this week is going to delight longtime listeners of delight or confound them when they remember back to when this name was obsessively mentioned on the podcast for a while. It felt like a year or two. You reviewed the new book by Emmanuel Carrère, Yoga. Carrère's, I say this with love, a weirdo, and his books they're very hard to classify. What is this one like?
He is a weirdo. I agree with that assessment. And I also share the loving tone in that word. So yoga is kind of hard to classify. Maybe you could call it autofiction. Maybe you could call it nonfiction with many liberties taken. But it's about it starts out, he announces his intention to write a light, upbeat book about yoga, which is something he practices. He practices meditation and Tai Chi. And he has the idea that if he writes a book about these topics for the casual reader, it'll sell like hotcakes, in his words. And then a series of terrible events happens, and the book becomes a chronicle of his hospitalization for depression and his diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Then he travels to Greece, and he spends time with a group of refugees there. And there's a fourth final part, which is about the death of a close friend. So it's a kind of wandering experience, but people who are familiar with Carrère will know that all of his book projects have that quality of, if you had to sum up his project, he writes about his encounters with the world, and then he arbitrarily divides those encounters into these book-esque objects.
We called the Lowell book a hodgepodge. It's true that Carrère's books, they tend to I almost don't trust him when he says, I have a hard time believing that he actually sat down to write a lighthearted book about yoga. Like in a Jeff Dyer-esque way, he starts at a point and then he just goes concentrically from there into all of these different thoughts and ideas. And you mentioned that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at some point, and he resisted that at first. Doesn't he compare it to being gluten-free or something?
Yeah, he implies that bipolar disorder is a kind of trendy diagnosis, and he says something like, it's one of those things where once it kind of gets into the zeitgeist, everybody thinks they have bipolar disorder, just as everyone thought they had a gluten intolerance. 5 minutes later, he reads a description of the condition and he realizes that it exactly describes him.
Molly, I've barely read Carrère. Where do you start?
I would start with The Adversary, which is his breakout book.
Oh, yeah, The Adversary is great.
Yeah, and it's a kind of combination of true crime and memoir. Everything he writes is a combination of something in memoir. I would say that for someone who's totally uninitiated, a reasonable analog would be Karl Ove Knausgaard, right? They're two European men, middle-aged, and write about personal things with just great vitality and force. And they're both these incredible chroniclers of irritation and frustration and petty emotions, but then they'll also zoom out to write about loftier topics, zooming from these heights down to the most repulsive trenches of human experience is their MO. That's
a great description. It's funny because Knausgaard is on certain levels the perfect comparison. And I had mentioned Jeff Dyer earlier. He's sort of it's almost like Jeff Dyer with the humor bleached out. And I know the humor is very important to you, Dwight, but Carrère is more funny I don't know if Molly will agree with this, and she has a great sense of humor, but like a Werner Herzog sort of unintentional funny where he just takes things so seriously and gets so irritated by things. I guess it's like a European Larry David or something.
Yes. He is both intentionally and unintentionally funny, which is a rare combination in people.
That is also very well said. Okay, so getting back to Yoga, the book, there is one wrinkle of it that's really interesting because he's obviously, he has a cult in the US for sure, but he's a giant, I think, writer celebrity in France. And this book was published there a couple of years ago. And it was published to not just raves and analysis, but to controversy in a way that involved, speaking of Knausgaard, that involved him and his ex-wife. What was that all about?
So his ex-wife is herself a journalist, and it came out that they divorced before the book was published in France. And around the time of the book's publishing, his ex-wife published an article in the French edition of Vanity Fair excoriating him for what she said was a failure to adhere to a contract that they had signed. And this is such an interesting, kind of unprecedented contract. But apparently one of the terms of their divorce was that he signed a piece of paper agreeing to run past her any appearances that she would make in his writing. So this is a woman who had appeared, many, many times in his writing intimately. But when they divorced, she didn't want to leave him with the ability to feature her as a character using her name in his works. And they signed a contract which stipulated that I think she would be able to review manuscripts, and if she had objections to the way that she was presented or her presence at all, then he would edit them out or change them. And so it sounded like from her article, she was alleging that he had put up some resistance or significant resistance to this when she came back to him with requests to be removed from yoga. And there is an outcry in France where some people were saying this is an appalling infringement on artistic freedom, and other people saying, well, it makes perfect sense that she wouldn't want her full name and intimate details to be used in a book which many people would read as nonfiction, even if it was labeled as fiction.
Is there a sense that have things been edited out of this book from the French version to more adhere to that contract, or it's unclear?
I haven't read the French version, so I can't do a paragraph by paragraph assessment, but there are omissions, and it does have the quality of something that's been censored or that things have been lifted out of. And Emmanuel Quer alludes to that. He'll say something like, then a crisis happened and I can't tell you what it was. Moving on. And you can piece together that, probably the crisis was marriage related.
So you're a career head. This is squarely a win for fans. Yes, it might not be his one or two best for you, but this is you pushing it into the hands of career fans.
Yeah, it's career to the 80th power. I feel like when people encounter him, they either totally love him or they absolutely hate him. And it's almost like a lactose intolerance where that's just an involuntary response. And I would say that the people who love him will welcome this book with open arms, and the people who can't tolerate him don't even need to pick it up.
You call him, I think, at some point the opposite of an acquired taste. You're either going to get it immediately or you're just going to hate him forever. You also, I just want to quote another sentence from your review, which is really great. You said his conversational prose style, which can impart the treacherous delusion that you, reader, might also become a famous novelist if you simply typed up 100% of your internal monologue and hit spell check. and that's exactly the experience you get reading him, just that he must have this brilliant internal thing going all the time that he just spools out onto the page. So let's tell listeners again what you reviewed this week.
I reviewed Memoirs by Robert Lowell.
And I reviewed Yoga by Emmanuel Quer.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.